This outcome is part of the findings of the research project Spatial Justice in Times of Urban Transition, SITO Transitions. Our research from August 2017 till November 2020 was funded by the UK's Department for International Development through its East Africa Research Fund. In order to understand how complex urban land markets influence spatial justice within the current urban transition in East Africa, we studied 4 cities in Uganda and Somaliland as and within integrated systems of given political economies.
In this video, 2 members of the project team, Professor Michael Walls and Dr. Colin Marx, discuss the challenges of managing land markets in Berbera and the implications for planning for a future equitable city.
So in the case of Berbera, what's the classic understanding of how land markets and planning work together?
The classic way of thinking about it is that planning supports the maximization of land values, and it does that by thinking of land as a commodity. The other relationship between planning and land markets is for planning to address market failures that arise out of land markets. And land markets are notorious for creating market failures. They fail to provide space for public facilities because everyone's focused on developing their own parcel of land. They often fail to provide environmental protection or recognize the importance of the environment, and they can fragment land uses so that it becomes very difficult to realize the values and the positive spin-offs from agglomeration and positive feedback between and spillovers between different land use activities.
Berbera has been notably very successful for a Somali city in planning to date. They've had an effective land registration system. What function does that planning process have in the context of the Berbera land market, and why would we be looking at that at the moment if it's already working well?
So Berbera is interesting in an African context, even not just a Somaliland context, as having a very well-functioning land administration system up until now. The city has coped extremely well to manage land and keep track of who owns what land and what's being done. But what's happening now is that with the arrival of the development in the port, is that the city's growth is speeding up. New land uses that have historically not been there are coming to the city much faster and in a different quantum. And so the question then is whether the system that Berbera has for managing its land and enabling land markets to work can continue to cope.
So in contrast to Hargeysa, the change in land markets is driven by the fact it's a big commercial centre, it's a political centre, you've got a lot of people moving there because of that. In Berbera's case, those factors are not there. It's the expansion of the port that seems to be driving changes in the land markets. You mentioned a couple of effects that has, but maybe could you elaborate a little more on how the port development is changing land markets and what that means for the current system?
Yeah, so up until now, the system, which is largely paper-based, has coped very well with land administration and supporting the land market that operates in Berbera. But what's happening with the arrival and the investment in the port is that new industries are attracted to the area that have not perhaps been there before. They're also in a greater quantity, so warehousing, activities related to the port that are important. So part of that is because the land is very cheap and it's relatively easy for industries to settle and establish in Berbera.
Okay. So what particular problems are likely to emerge or are emerging?
So what we're seeing is industry establishing itself in places where it's having negative spillover effects on the surrounding urban environment, which is something that you don't want to happen. We're also seeing cases where industry or commercial activity is locating in places where it would have a more positive effect, or there'd be more agglomerative effects if it was next to existing activities, and so create positive feedback loops. So what we're seeing now is potentially the start of a breakdown in the system, or not so much a breakdown. But what we're seeing now is that the existing paper system is struggling a little bit to cope with the fast pace of change and the nature of new industries coming in, where they're locating, and how to manage that process. So, how do we think the land market is working in Berbera at the moment?
Well, I think as we both mentioned earlier, Berbera has actually got a remarkably functional land market. The city is still quite an equal city in a lot of ways. It's important, I think, to put that in the context that it has been for many, many years a very small city that has only recently started to experience the pressure of growth. And I think its size probably accounts for some of these elements. But also, it's very significant that it has this functional land registration system. So people are actually paying tax on land transactions, which means that the municipality has some functional capacity that isn't there in a lot of other cities. One of the interesting things about Berbera is the dominance of rental as a means that people use to access land. That's quite different from a lot of cities. I think we found about 42% of people were where they were on the basis of a rental agreement. That reflects the local condition in which summers are very hot, so you tend to get many people living in Berbera, leaving Berbera for the summer and returning in the cooler months. So rental kind of suits that mobile population quite well. What about you? Did you see other aspects of the Berbera situation which were particularly notable?
I think the other issue to draw out is an issue of social trust. So there seems to be high levels of social trust in the land market, and a very high percentage of people reported finding it very easy to find land in Berbera. So that it would indicate that it's working well and that people trust each other. I think part of that is that there seems to be very widespread and a high availability of land.
I think that's true, and I think even more, Hargeysa has quite close ties between people, but Berbera surpasses that by a magnitude, in the sense that almost everyone seems connected with each other, and the level of transparency in terms of what they know about each other's incomes, how much they paid for land, that kind of thing, is really incredibly high. So that sort of seems to support that sense that there's this level of trust and transparency, both hand in hand, which makes it was notable when we were doing the interviewing for the research how little disagreement there was over price. So working out how much a piece of land was worth, most people seemed to find relatively easy, and there wasn't that much difference between the price that was set by an intending seller or by an agent, a broker, or that was expected by the buyer, because they all knew already what similar pieces of land had been sold for before and how much that person was asking and so on. That really set Berbera apart in a way for me in terms of the way the land market worked, certainly from Hargeysa, but also from other cities, including the other two cities in Uganda that we were looking at.
Yeah, and a key part of that is the land administration system run by the municipality that's keeping a record of that in a very public way, so that even if you're not party to that particular transaction, you can have some recourse to that information.
So it's interesting that with Hargeysa, it felt as though one of the things that had somehow was related to the fact that the planning system hadn't become more effective was the fact that there was this trust system that sort of enabled people to bypass or ignore planning. In Berbera you have both. You have high levels of trust, but you also have actually quite an effective registration and municipally run planning system. So that's an interesting finding, I think.
Yeah, and perhaps that suggests some ideas about thinking about the relationship between planning and land markets, because what it would suggest is that land administration system is somehow integrated with the land market. And so what we were looking at in our research was how different aspects of the land market contribute to that functioning. And so some of those elements were that people transact for many different reasons. They don't only transact because they think land is a commodity. They're looking for an asset, they're looking for somewhere to stay. And so in thinking forward, and when we weren't investigating planning as part of the research, but in thinking forward from what we found for what planning would have to do in Berbera, one of the things would be for planning to recognize that diversity in why people need land, and to somehow be sensitive to that, rather than thinking of land only as a commodity.
So it's kind of a halfway point, I think, between the classic understanding of planning. If the classic understanding of planning is that it's there to maximize urban land value and ensure that the market is working as efficiently, economically efficiently as possible, if that's one view, another view is that planning, maybe this is an even more old-fashioned one, that planners come in with a kind of blueprint approach to setting out zones and setting out, how the city is going to be shaped and how it's going to look. Is what we're talking about somehow finding some point in between those that's both flexible but still has a focus on the socialization of the effects of planning that goes beyond just making the market work in an economically efficient way? Would that be a fair?
I think so. Yeah, I think that it's somewhere in the middle there, because what it's got to do is recognize that there are many different ways in which people hold property rights to land, rather than only in one form, which becomes a commodified form. And so it can't do that if it goes the blueprint way, because the blueprint way is homogenizing land, it's standardizing it, it's making it amenable to becoming a commodity. Whereas if planning is recognizing that diversity of the ways that people hold property rights in land, and in Berbera I think there are at least three, right? Ways of three legal systems.
And there are three legal systems in the Somali context anyway, in the sense you've got the customary, you've got the religious, the Sharia, and you've got the regulatory sort of system. In Berbera, it's interesting that the regulatory system has, in effect, such a significant impact. And that's more because of this fact that the municipality has a capacity, has a register, and is able to enforce payment of taxes and so on. But still those three coexist with each other. So yeah, those would be the three systems.
Yeah, so planning would need to cope with that, rather than just pretend that everything beyond the regulatory doesn't exist. And so that would definitely be some kind of pointer to the way planning needs to work. The other thing would be to recognize that, as is currently happening in Berbera, the municipality is able to allocate land to Somaliland citizens, and it's doing that outside of the market in a way. So what's happening is the land that's being allocated to Somaliland citizens is really on the periphery, and that's going to be unsustainable for the city. It's unsustainable for the people who are getting the land that are too far away from the amenities of the city, and eventually they'll give that land up, or perhaps move somewhere else, and it'll defeat the purpose. So somehow planning needs to recognize that people have particular rights to land because of who they are, and bring those processes into a more inclusive planning approach.